We asked Ryan and Paige Wolfberg and Worth several months ago to help us by providing some resources that could be provided to stakeholders associated with the exchange of EMS data to more fully promote kind of the bi-directional movement of that data. We'll have a lot of time today to technically deal with those issues and how we can move forward based on some recent decisions that were announced in the ONC Cures Act final rule, which just came out in June. But there's also the political side to it, right? There's also the side where states, hospitals, HIEs have some reluctance or take a conservative approach to the bi-directional flow of data for a number of reasons. And that's why we asked Mr. Stark, who really is the HIPAA expert at PWW, to help us develop some tools that would help us with those political decisions, those security decisions, the decisions that are often made by legal teams associated with these healthcare facilities. And we've asked Ryan if he could give us a review of what he found when he was preparing the documents that are now available. And we will post the location of the two documents that Ryan has provided in the chat, so you'll be able to refer to those while Ryan speaks to us. Ryan, I'd like to turn the screen over to you.
Sure, thank you very much. With that, I really appreciate the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. This is an exciting thing and a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. When I came in, I've been an attorney now at Paige Wolfberg and Worth for about 13 years, and HIPAA has been sort of my bailiwick or my burden to bear, as it may be, since I joined the law firm. So I remember joining and somebody saying to me, "Hey, what do you know about HIPAA?" And I said, "Well, I know a little bit. You know, I've worked in the healthcare field for long enough." And they said, "Great, you're going to be our HIPAA person from here on out." So I get to do all sorts of fun things, like go to the annual HIPAA summit in DC, right? So if any of you have been there, it's like a Star Trek convention for HIPAA nerds. It's stuff that we love and we like to talk about. One of the things that persists are these misconceptions about HIPAA in general. And, you know, while there may be some technical barriers or there might be other, you know, barriers out there that stand in the way, you know, as an impediment, you know, to sharing data and sharing bi-directional data, HIPAA simply is not one of them. And my primary and our primary focus here in authoring this, what we did, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment, we came up with a new resource for organizations out there who go to hospital administrators and, you know, the folks when they're talking about gaining information to outcome data, and what do they always throw up? One word, right? HIPAA. And it's just very, very frustrating from the other end, you know, when they're putting up this barrier. And we entitled this an imaginary barrier because really it is. When we get back to HIPAA, and we'll talk just a little bit about the history of HIPAA too, HIPAA was meant to promote the sharing of patient data. It was meant so that we can take our insurance from one employer to the next. You know, it was meant to promote transactional standards that we're all on the same page. So all these misconceptions out there about how HIPAA stands in the way, we need to put to rest once and for all. And that's what this paper proposes to do. And like I said, if there are other impediments that we need to deal with down the road, we're more than happy to take those on as well. But let's, you know, start with this and really get this out of the way. So I want to kick off here just a little bit about our law firm. We're just celebrating our 20th year, and we represent EMS agencies and agencies who deal in the industry all across the United States. We have clients in every state. We also represent third-party billing companies, some software vendors we've done work for. So this is really our passion. And the folks that founded our firm have been out in the field. They've been providers. And we really carry home our mantra is we always provide simple advice. You know, when it comes, I remember one of the first times going to my first client site visit and talking to a firefighter about inputting data, and it was about his ePCR device. And one of the things he said to me, I said, well, this is what you're supposed to do. And he said, Ryan, you're talking to a guy that if I walk up to a door and it's locked, then I break it. You know what I mean? So we will find the fastest way and the quickest way to get through these things and these prompts. So what we try to do as our law firm is when the rubber hits the road, we try to give you practical advice that is really meaningful. You know, it's one thing to say what the law says. It's quite another to apply it to the EMS industry, because the EMS industry was really an afterthought with a lot of the laws that we're dealing with. Just want to put this up there. Anybody familiar with the good old show Emergency? The gentleman on the right there is actually Jim Page, who was a battalion chief for Los Angeles County, one of our founding partners. Interesting backstory, many of you may not know this, but Johnny Gage was actually supposed to be named Jim Page. Jim was a technical advisor with Jack Webb on the show Emergency, and they wanted to name it after him. But at the end of the day, he said, if this whole paramedic thing goes south, I don't want to be associated with that. So we sort of changed the name slightly to protect the innocent there. So just a brief history about us. So let's go back in time with me, permit me for just a moment here to go back to my college days. April 14th, 2003. That date may mean something to some of you out there. For those of you who are familiar with HIPAA, you're probably intimately familiar with that. It was the compliance date for HIPAA. So HIPAA was passed by the Clinton administration. It was written in 1996, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And then what happened was they started to issue some regulations. The regulations are really the meat of HIPAA, what the law says here. But what happened was the Clinton administration had written some of the regulations. Then the George W. Bush administration revised some of those regulations. So the compliance date was April 14th, 2003. And why do I have Giant Eagle? For those of you from the Pittsburgh area, you'll be familiar with that grocery store. It's a grocery store out here. Excuse me. And they happen to have a pharmacy in there. And back in my college days at IUP, I was a pharmacy technician. So I remember this date distinctly, because what happened was, we came to work and they're like, oh, there's this new law in place. The biggest change for me, we had a trash can with 2 slots now. So all the health information, protected health information, went in the right side and it would go to be shredded or eviscerated, and then all the regular trash would go on the left side. That was the biggest change for me. And we had to listen to that awful HIPAA training, like, welcome to the privacy rule, ladies and gentlemen, and this is how you can share information. And some of it was our own fault, because when HIPAA came out, we just thought the earth had changed. And instead of going through and actually reading what the regulations said and reading the purpose behind HIPAA and what it was meant to do, we took it all as, oh my gosh, everybody clams up now, and now we can't share patient information. So wanted to share something, what happened to me actually on that date, on April 14th, 2003. I remember looking at a prescription that was brought in, and I couldn't decipher whether or not it was BID or TID, once or twice daily. So I called the physician's office and I said, hey, need some clarification on this prescription. And the person on the other end gave me one word. They said, I can't share that with you. And I said, oh, why not? And they said, HIPAA, right? One word, which is often the word that we encounter when we go to hospitals and facilities, and they say, we can't give you that information. That's HIPAA. So that was the response that I got. And not only that, I was admonished that I was violating HIPAA by using the patient's name over the phone. So, some of that still persists today. So brief history here. Like I said, the law was written back then. We had the privacy rule in 2003, and then the security rule came along. And that's the one, and actually they just issued a new risk analysis tool for those of you who pay attention to that stuff. They just issued a new tool for conducting a risk analysis, but everybody was required to comply with the security rule in 2005, and it was sort of an afterthought after the privacy rule. The HIPAA has not changed a whole heck of a lot over those years. We did have the High Tech Act back in 2009, and that was the rule that gave us the breach notification rule. That was pretty big, actually, but not too many other changes came through the pipeline. And the compliance date for most of those rules was 2013, so a little bit of a history. Here's the point. This regulation, I quote, I don't like quoting the law to people, but I think somebody might have an open mic there, so if you just want to check. Here's the law, 45 CFR, and I quote this to people, I quote it to hospital administrators all the time, 45 CFR 164.506. If you type that into the Google, that is the regulation that definitively states that covered entities, remember covered entities are those healthcare providers who engage in HIPAA standard transactions. That's the regulation that affirmatively says that we can share, by the way, without the patient's authorization, we can share protected health information for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. And we can not only use it for our own internal purposes, but we can share it with other organizations and other covered entities who are involved in treating the patient. You know, if we need payment information from other organizations. This regulation was effective the entire time, ladies and gentlemen. So you could have on April 14th, 2003, if the hospital refused to give you outcome data, given them this regulation, said, no, this is really what the regulation says right now. And when we get back to, like I said, the whole purpose behind HIPAA was, a big part of the rule was the transaction code set rule, right? So we could all be on the same sheet of music. It was meant to endorse and promote the sharing of patient information and homogenizing transactions through which we share information. That was the whole purpose of HIPAA. There's a lot of legislative history and language. If you go back and read the law, it says this is what we're meaning to do, is to make providers talk to one another a little more. We'll talk about an initiative too that's on the books right now that's going to take that a little bit further. So fast forward to January 29th of 2020. And this is really bizarre because I remember this date because it was right before what happened? COVID, right? You know, we had the declaration of the public health emergency actually on January 28th. And this is when everything hit the fan. This is when we were still hosting in-person conferences at this point. It seems like forever ago. You know, it looks like a decade. So the National Pre-Hospital Data Integration Summit, which I was in attendance along with Dr. Mann and some of you perhaps were in attendance as well. And one of the things that I kept hearing over and over and over are that, hey, hospitals don't want to participate in the HIE, or they don't want to give us access to their outcome data, and they don't want to give us any data on the back end. And one of the things that they're citing, in fact, the main reason that they're citing is HIPAA. So years, 17 years after the privacy rule went in effect and we had this regulation that says that we could share information, here's the thing. The perception that we can't share that information becomes reality, and it still is reality today. So that's what we sort of went to fight against. And in fact, at that conference, I approached Dr. Mann. It was just really, really bugging me because I go to HIPAA Summit and I learn about, interoperability and how everybody's sharing information. I learn about how EMS is being integrated in health information exchanges in California and how, the medic and EMT on the street can show up and look at the patient's full medical history and have access to that data. And then we hear statements like this at the conference that, the perception is still that hospitals can't share that information. And we have assisted NEMSIS before, back when NEMSIS was getting off the ground and in its nascent stages. There were concerns about sharing information about whether or not HIPAA allowed and permitted organizations to share with NEMSIS. So we did author an opinion that still exists on NEMSIS website today, talking about why HIPAA does permit you to share information with NEMSIS. So we came up with this idea, and pardon me, originally we talked about doing just a legal opinion, which there is a complement legal opinion to this white paper. So wanted to go back and put together, a more comprehensive resource that really shuts down some of those arguments that we're seeing concerning HIPAA, and doing a comprehensive review of the privacy, security, and breach notification rule, and how all those rules work in conjunction to actually promote bidirectional sharing. So here's the objectives of that paper. Obviously, first and foremost, we wanted to talk about why it's critical in today's world. I'm sorry, the little cutoff there. And to explain how the HIPAA privacy rule and federal agencies both permit and promote bidirectional patient information sharing, okay? HIPAA was written for the protection of patients. One of the things that the privacy rule does, not only does it dictate how we can use and disclose information, and the big three are TPO, which allows us to do pretty much most of what we need to do on a daily basis, but another big part of HIPAA was granting you and I rights regarding our protected health information, right? One of the things that I can do today is walk into my physician's office, call up my hospital and ask for a copy of all my medical records. I can do that with the EMS agency. HIPAA is one of the things that gave me that right. So HIPAA was written for patients, not only for the protection of patients, but for the promotion of health data sharing. So, and finally, to address the HIPAA security and breach notification rules. So I don't need to sit here and talk all day behind the justification of why this is critical. But it should be concerning that I can travel across the country to Los Angeles and purchase something in the store, and I can immediately see that transaction on my phone. It's in my banking account and see it right away. But if I were to fall down on my way out of the convenience store and suffer, God forbid, cardiac arrest or other event, the EMS crew may or may not know anything about my medical history. They may or may not know anything about my allergies. Not only that, the lack of access to that information at the time of care, but think about the standards that we always look to. We always talk about evidence-based practice, right? Well, EMS is really not the star child for evidence-based practice. We still look to things like 8 minutes and 59-second response times when, sometimes the evidence really doesn't back that up for a lot of our calls as well. This is critical because if we expect to see evidence-based practice take hold within the EMS community, we really need to see what patient outcomes are, how they are responding to the interventions, to the medications, and the care that we're providing. Not only that, any of you who have been a provider on the street can probably speak to how frustrating it is, if you've shown up on scene, worked a patient, transfer them at the emergency department, knowing full well that you may never know whether or not that patient actually made it at the end of the day. It's critical because when we get outcome information, that's positive reinforcement for our providers as well. They can find out exactly what happened to the patient, and it improves the EMS system overall for agencies and communities nationwide. So very, very critical, and especially in today's world. In fact, the Office for Civil Rights, these are the folks that actually enforce HIPAA, issued specific guidance, and it basically says, hey, hospitals, facilities, skilled nursing facilities, you can disclose COVID-19 information to law enforcement officials, paramedics, and other first responders and public health authorities. And by the way, what they said in this guidance is, hey, look, we're not making up any new regulations here. You've always had this right. So for those of you who want to show them, other concrete documents, you can go to this website and download the Office for Civil Rights guidance concerning sharing information with first responders and paramedics. They've always had the ability to do that. If you've been checking your inboxes, if you're signed up for the listserv, the ET3 model, big announcement today. It is going forward, number one, and they've announced that they're going to start January 1st of 2021, okay? So the emergency triage, treat, and transport model. This is also critical because one of the things that you have to, if you're a participant in ET3, is to demonstrate either willingness or that you're already integrated into an HIE. So if you are not, in that health information exchange and you're being, excluded, or they're censoring, some of the data that you need, that's a problem. So this is really critical as we move to, new models of delivery of care. One of the EMS 2050 agenda estimated that about 12% of transports in the year 2050, or 12% of calls will actually end up in a transport. So really, really critical that we get on board with interoperability and we put aside any impediments like HIPAA. By the way, it's endorsed by the Office of the National Coordinator. Here are resources that endorse health information exchange and data integration. The one on the right there talks about a couple of studies in Southern California using the SAFER model and how those medics and EMTs on the street have access to real-time data. and data that uh, paints a full picture of the patient that they encounter on the street. So let's get to the meat of it here. Let's talk about how HIPAA and federal agencies promote and permit bidirectional sharing. So, treatment. Healthcare providers, I mentioned that regulation before, healthcare providers can freely share information back and forth between one another for treatment-related reasons. Here's how it's defined. Pretty broad definition: the provision, coordination, management of healthcare and related services by one or more providers. So already permits that in the regulation. No patient consent is necessary for treatment. In fact, originally when they passed HIPAA, they were going to require patient consent in order to share information. They did away with patient consent for most disclosures and uses under HIPAA, including treatment, including the big three: TPO. And by the way, this can be either current treatment, so if I'm at a facility, we can exchange information with one another. That also includes prospective treatment. If I need to know about the patient's allergies, or care that they received in a facility, follow-up care as the EMS provider, they can put that information into a health information exchange. HIPAA endorses either current or prospective treatment-related activities. Providers can also share for a whole host of healthcare operations, and this has been made clear. We'll talk about a resource too that made this clear. But anything like conducting QA, QI, clinical guidelines, developing protocols, HIPAA permits the free exchange of information among healthcare providers for these purposes. In other words, a hospital can give me information for any of these purposes listed under healthcare operations, already written in there, and that's what it talks about in the white paper. And by the way, they issued a letter, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response under the Department of Health and Human Services issued a letter to this effect and said, hey, by the way, at a recent conference on data integration, when we noted that a number of stakeholders were standing up and saying that HIPAA still persists and people believe that they can't share information because of HIPAA. We want to make it clear that, yeah, you can. So they said hospitals may share health outcome information with EMS practitioners for certain healthcare operations activities of the EMS practitioners, such as quality improvement activities, as long as both entities have had a relationship with that patient, making it very clear. So that's another resource that we actually cite in this white paper. And here's an interesting development too, and this is what they call a request for information. Okay, I'm not going to go into the history of how regulations come about, but essentially what they do with regulations is they go through a proposed rule format and then a final rule format. Well, sometimes prior to that, they ask the public for information. This was issued in December of 2018, and we're hoping to hear comments from stakeholders soon. But essentially what this request for information said is, hey, listen, we understand that healthcare providers, we wrote into the law that they can share information for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. But guess what? We're still hearing that healthcare providers aren't sharing for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, and they're refusing to participate in the meaningful exchange of data. This request for information specifically asks the public whether or not we should write in a solid requirement into the rule that healthcare providers and covered entities share for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations purposes. So it's possible that in the next couple of years, we could see a rule actually written into HIPAA that would require the information sharing. Currently, it's a permissive rule. And I think the government's kind of kicking themselves now because they said, maybe we should have written this requirement in long ago. And that's what this request for information is getting at, that they may actually require, and we're still monitoring this to see if it comes to a proposed rule, but they asked for comments, and our law firm issued comments as well. So let's talk about security too, okay? One of the arguments, so, obviously the privacy rule allows us to do it. There's also the security rule that comes along with HIPAA. The security rules has administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. By the way, all EMS providers, all HIPAA-covered EMS providers are required to comply with all of these security standards that you see on your screen here. What does that mean? That means when the hospital says, well, we're just worried about the security of that data when we send it your way. We're just not sure if the EMS provider, or whatever agency is as secure as we are. Folks, There's a little bit of flexibility written into the HIPAA security rule, but these regulations apply in the same fashion to hospitals, to solo practitioners, to EMS providers, and the like. They have to implement all those standards. That means we have to have certain access permissions, that role-based access for our folks. We have to have workforce authorization and training, and we have to sanction individuals if they violate the rules. We have to have workstation device and security. The other thing is too, as well, how do we know that individuals, aren't snooping on records? We're concerned about that. One of the audit controls that every EMS provider and every HIPAA covered entity is required to implement is periodically they need to be running access logs to determine whether proper access is being made to those records. So all of these measures that you see here, EMS agencies are required to implement. So if anybody tells you that, they're concerned about the security, the same transmission security standards as well, they have to consider encryption for any time the data is at rest, in transit. So the white paper talks about how the security rule applies in the same fashion to EMS agencies that it does to hospitals and other facilities. And then the last concern, is what about breaches of protected health information? Horror of horrors, and breaches do happen, okay? Here's the thing, folks. Protected health information is individually identifiable information that's created or received by a healthcare provider. So let's talk about that for just a moment. And the word received is obviously highlighted here. That means that once a hospital or whatever facility loads information into a health information exchange database or transmits information back to a healthcare provider, including an EMS agency, once that EMS agency receives that information, or once it's in the HIE, any breach that occurs, that protected health information becomes protected health information either of the business associate, if it were health information exchange, or of the covered entity, if it's an EMS provider. Once I receive protected health information, guess what? It's mine. And if it gets breached while it's in my possession, that is my breach. That is no longer the hospital's breach. So if the hospital gives the providers a face sheet, and let's say it's a paper face sheet, and lo and behold, they walk out in the hospital parking lot and it flies away in that hospital parking lot, that is now the breach of the EMS agency. Same thing if they were to transmit electronically any information, any outcome data back to the EMS agency, provided they did it through a secure fashion and it was under the auspices of, allowing them to conduct QA/QI, guess what? That breach is the breach of the EMS agency, not of the hospital. The EMS agency is not a business associate acting on behalf of the hospital there. So we talk about that in the white paper as well. So breaches of the EMS provider are not breaches of the hospital. By the way, that rule applies even if I get information that I'm not supposed to have. So let's say, for example, the EMS agency receives information regarding patients that maybe were not patients of the EMS agency. They weren't supposed to receive that information, but guess what? They can't do anything with it that would violate HIPAA. They have a separate and independent duty under HIPAA to safeguard that information, just like information of their own patients. Once it's received by the EMS agency, it becomes protected health information of that EMS agency, and anything that happens to it becomes the obligation of the EMS agency, and they would have to conduct any breach notification if that were necessary. So walking through, that's just kind of a quick overview, and we're going to make this resource available. Like I said, one of the thing that I really wanted to do was take away any argument that folks could make under HIPAA. We're hoping that this will at least start to open dialogue and start to bridge the gap, where people are throwing that up as an impediment. While, yeah, there may be other impediments that exist, maybe technological, or if there are other, laws that may exist that we have to conquer, okay, HIPAA is not one of them. And this is the resource that gets out and tells these individuals that it's not. And so with that, I have not been monitoring the chat, but we can go ahead and open it up if we have questions, comments, or otherwise.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that overview. That was incredibly helpful. Lots of very important topics that are covered in greater detail in this document. So that's fantastic. I'll remind folks if they would press the button to raise their hand. We'll call on those folks if there are questions. There's been great comments in the chat, not questions yet. You can also post a question via the chat for Ryan. I'll remind folks we'll continue to chat with Ryan, but probably about 5 minutes to 10, we will end the conversation with Ryan, because we do want to have a breakout room where we're able to take this background information that Ryan's provided and then to think through a comment that Ryan made earlier. What in addition can we do to deal with other barriers that may be persistent in hospitals' minds or in others in regards to that curtailed this exchange, right? For example, do we have hospitals out there that don't feel like they can make this exchange because they're not sure the EMS agencies have the proper protections in place? Well, what does that mean? Do we need to provide some further education to EMS agencies? Could that be helpful? Those kind of ideas we'll talk about in the breakout session. But Ryan, thank you. And we'll turn it over to those, I think, who've raised their hands.
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Good morning, Ryan, and good morning, everyone. We have a question from Christian Witt with MediView.
Sure.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And appreciate the presentation. Totally agree with everything. And one of the slides that you had on there that I wanted to really bring up is the perception reality, that iceberg slide. That's pretty much exactly what we're seeing in the field right now. So that totally points to what's happening. And one of the biggest things that, if there's anything that says that you can't share patient data with the rest of the community or anyone that's involved, they say it's HIPAA. HIPAA is the go-to word, even though the big one that even one of my colleagues brought up, which is SAMHSA, is one of the biggest ones that we actually see out there. When you are looking at someone that has something to do with substance abuse, for example, or mental health, whenever they say, no, I can't share, do not share my information, people don't understand the difference of different laws. They just say HIPAA, because that's what they hear all the time. So have you guys looked into something with SAMHSA, for example, with the technical requirements of, you know what, you cannot share this data back to EMS now. It has to be limited. It has to be controlled. Is this something that you guys have looked into or can talk about?
Sure, we may have looked into this quite a while back. Again, remember that with SAMHSA, these are organizations that hold themselves out as, treatment centers for substance abuse and mental health. And that law will, in most cases, require the consent of the patient in order to share specifically records related to substance abuse or mental health. So if they're citing that, we need to go back to, we need to make sure that that's the law that they're relying on. And remember that they can still share other information not related to substance abuse, mental health with EMS providers without the consent of the patient. So we haven't been specifically tasked to look at that, but if that is a recurrent theme, maybe we can step in and parse that a little bit and talk a little bit more about who is covered by the law. First of all, not every organization is covered, not every healthcare facility is covered by that law. And then what specifically is covered by the law? In other words, what do we need consent in order to share? And if we do need consent, what's the best way about going about that? And keep in mind too, that this would impose the obligation on the hospital to filter those specific records that are covered by the law if they are an organization that is covered. So yeah, we could certainly, if that's something that you want us to look into, or if that's a barrier that we need to break down as well, we'd be more than happy to look into that. And I can actually give you, let me give out my email address. It's rstark@pwwemslaw.com. If anybody wants to reach out to me regarding that issue, I'd be more than happy to look into that on your behalf and, to tackle any other impediments as well. Good question.
Thank you.
If there's no other raised hands, I'll just mention some of the chat here briefly. So if folks are following the chat, Jonathan Fite has provided a nice narrative regarding SAMHSA as a conversation has continued. Jay Osby out of Wyoming asked, time permitting, could we get a specific language that specifies that EMS agency is responsible for the breach of PHI, excuse me, versus the hospital? This was a great tidbit. Thank you for your time. Ryan, does the legal opinion speak specifically to some kind of a documentation that deals specifically with the responsibility of EMS agencies?
Yeah, the white paper does refer to a specific resource that was put out, I believe, by the Office of the National Coordinator that specifically talks to that circumstance. It doesn't mention EMS, but the analysis is the same when it comes to dealing with covered entities. I believe what it talks about is a transaction between a hospital and a physician, and it talks about the hospital sharing information with that physician, and then once it becomes the protected health information of that physician, the physician has the obligation, and there is a citation to that within the white paper as well. But yeah, it does specifically speak to that. When we talk about covered entities, that term is fairly fungible. You know, in other words, if you know, EMS providers are covered entities, so we can insert EMS provider in the place of physician in that circumstance. So yeah, we do specifically mention that in the white paper. Great question.
Ryan, we have another question from Scott Matthews with Star West.
Sure.
Yeah, so my question has to do with from the patient side. And once my information is in this HIE, how do I know who has access to it, and how do I request that information if it's could be available to anyone within the system?
Sure. So there's a great question. There are built-in access controls. We talked about the parameters of the security rule. Security rule specifically mandates only the provisioning of access to information that's necessary for treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. So that's up to the system to build in access controls. And you know, while it's in the database, like I always say, just because you have access to information doesn't mean you have a legal right to look at the information. And there are audit controls on the back end that we can search through for improper access if anybody is looking into those records. And I've dealt with that personally. You know, it does come up from time to time where organizations will find when they run an audit log that somebody has been in a record and shouldn't have been there, and we have to flesh that out and determine what happens. And then the patient may have to be notified about that. Regarding your question concerning how do I get access to that information, the right of access falls on the covered entity itself. So whomever is the repository, whomever is the covered entity and has that designated record set is where the patient would need to go to request a copy of those records. And there are patients who have authorized their information be uploaded, you know, as part of a personal healthcare record. And there are HIEs who provision access to the full complement of that record as well. So all depends on how that's structured, but what the law places the onus on is the actual provider to provide a copy of that record. But HIPAA, what they didn't want to happen is that providers have to go seek the patient's permission every time. Let's say, for example, you know, we want to do quality assurance on a particular case. They didn't want to have to go back to the patient every single time because that seems like a legitimate and proper use of that healthcare information. So they recognize that they're ceding a little bit of, you know, the control, and they're taking a little bit of control concerning that record from the patient, but it needs to be specifically for purposes of treatment, payment, healthcare operations, or one of those other permissive uses and disclosures under HIPAA. So there should be protections in there, and there are ways to go back and audit through access. Every time somebody looks at a record, accesses a record, there's a digital footprint there. And I harp on this all the time when I do trainings, you know, whether you're a cloud server, whomever, you should definitely be running access logs and making sure the proper access is occurring.
Okay, we have another question from Christian Witt.
Okay.
Hello again. Yeah, this is definitely a topic that we've discussed internally for a while and even put out a few publications on. And so just to follow up from the previous question that was asking you about SAMHSA, one of the things that you brought up is bringing people to mental health facilities. And I think the question comes when you have someone having a mental, some type of mental issue or even the substance abuse issue that goes to the ED. It becomes something that is common for all of us here, where, excuse me, when they're being transported, and if they do have something where they say, no, don't share my information, that becomes this other SAMHSA issue. But beyond that, we're all technology vendors. We are looking at, okay, how can we automate this? How can we make this electronic? And going into that, you have a few additional things that have come out in the last several years, specifically the 21st Century Cures Act, which is looking at limiting how you share information. And with that, it's regulating a specific technology called FHIR, as this has to be the way that you share the information. So I'm wondering, do you guys look into that at all as far as this bi-directional patient data exchange with EMS and how that needs to happen? Is NEMSIS talking with you guys about, with this new law, how does this affect the standards that are being created for EMS?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. We have not been specifically tasked to looking into that. We're at this point trying to bridge the gap concerning HIPAA, and that's what this resource is about. We have not specifically been tasked to do that, but would certainly be open to looking into how the 21st Century Cures Act comes into play as well. Good point.
There's a question in the chat. Legally, are there ramifications for failing to communicate pertinent health information to covered entities? For example, if an unfounded concern about HIPAA results in a delay of needed intervention. And this is from Kathleen Cunningham at NHTSA.
Sure, that's a really good question. Legally, no, at least under the regulation. Now, could somebody bring potentially a private negligence suit against a healthcare organization for not sharing information that was necessary to help somebody to prevent injury or death? Certainly maybe a private lawsuit, but again, HIPAA right now, that regulation that I cited before, 45 CFR 164.506, says that covered entities may but are not required to share information. There is a movement right now, like I had mentioned before, the request for information. And that request for information is asking whether or not they should build in a requirement specifically into HIPAA to require the sharing of information for treatment-related reasons. So really good question, but yeah, the law does not close, at least HIPAA does not close the loop in terms of making it mandatory to share that information currently, but it's possible we could see that requirement in the future. Good question.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. If there are no more questions, this is a great time for us to wrap this up. Thank you. It was incredibly helpful. I think a lot of people had great questions, and this has been incredibly helpful. I think these tools will help much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, folks, as I mentioned, we do have an opportunity now to break into groups to talk a little bit about how, let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. What additional work perhaps we could do to help handle these legal or other security questions. I'm gonna put who has become a good friend of NEMSIS. He chatted me privately, Neil Milan. He may not be completely grateful that I do this, but he asks great questions. Neil Milan is actually the real expert associated with ET3. He's been gracious enough to join us during our meeting. He'll be presenting to us tomorrow morning. where we stand with ET3. I know everybody's incredibly excited about that. It'll be great to talk to him about our technical progress in regards to preparing to send CMS data related to ET3. He asked a great question here, and I think it kind of sets us up for our breakout sessions. He mentions, since HIPAA is structured as a permissible law, sharing needs to be encouraged since it isn't required. Is the perception of organizational risk, e.g. breaches and sanctions, a big barrier to sharing? Right, so these perceptions of organizational risk, that is perhaps an area that we could discuss later, and would love you to discuss in your 10-minute breakout sessions. Really, are there other attributes of this idea about security or risk that we could approach in a structured document like we've had Ryan promote to this point? Are there other ideas? I mean, an ideas give it here, a guide for EMS policies regarding data security and confidentiality. Is there some assurances that hospitals could receive, even though, as Ryan has made the point, that the breach falls to the receiver of the data, but are there other ways that we can somehow quell risk or concern about the sharing of data? So this is your question. You'll be put into new breakout groups today, and this group will persist into the next breakout. So you'll have 10 minutes, and as you did yesterday, please organize if you can quickly, have a great discussion, and we'll go back and go through each of the groups. I think there are now 12 groups, so the groups may be a little bit bigger, but please break into your groups. Talk about this from a software provider who's attempting to facilitate exchanges with products, and also from the state level. What are the states hearing in regards to connections to HIEs and others? What are the issues that still continue to plague those connections? So Chris, if you'd be so kind as to break folks off into their groups, and we'll be back together in 10 minutes. All right, folks, thank you for coming back with us. We have two more very important topics to cover today. This is a really important day in the meeting. A great discussion regarding how we can facilitate bidirectional data exchange, kind of dealing with the business side of that case. We'll spend the later half of the meeting dealing with the technical side of that case, with some new releases that have come out from the federal government and new guidelines. We need some direction here at the TAC. Eric needs some direction at the Office of EMS to determine how best to utilize funds that are made available to facilitate that bidirectional flow. So we'll look forward to getting into that discussion. I'll mention, if you're looking at the agenda there, that will happen from 11:25 to 12:25 Mountain Time. I'll just mention there that that will be a just two group split, where we have the vendors in one, broadly speaking, in one group, and we have state data managers in the other group. The state data managers will be working on a NASEMSO resolution. I'll just mention to those state data managers, we come back together as a group at 12:25 Mountain Time to discuss what we came up with in regards to bidirectional data flow. So the discussions that happen in the HIE session, we'll share with the state data managers, so you won't be left out of that conversation. So, but right now, what we'd like to delve into a little bit, as we're now clearly set back a little bit in regards to our moving to version 3.5 with the COVID outbreak this year, we want to have a really meaningful conversation about how we can do a better job of rolling out version 3.5 to states and to agencies, trying to reduce the drag, the burden that folks feel associated with a new version of coming out, a new version of NEMSIS coming out. So clearly, the Office of EMS, Eric has expressed this need to mix up whatever we can to make sure this process will work more fluidly. So we're very much looking forward to your comments. I'm going to basically just set this up, and then we'd like you to go back into your breakout groups. We've actually extended it for another 5 minutes because there'll be basically 3 questions we want you to address, and I'll go through each of those. So you'll have 15 minutes together as a group. The first item we want you to discuss is the idea of the schedule of the rollout. So this of course is just a high level schedule, but people look to it to kind of help them develop at the state level guidelines for when they'd like their state and agencies to transition. I think software companies use this just to plan scope of works and other things that are associated with NEMSIS 3.5. I'll mention that in the spring, we rolled everything back, particularly the green flags, 6 months. And the Office of EMS left open the idea that we may need to extend that out farther based on what happened with COVID in 2020. That'll be one of your questions is do we need to, again, consider revamping this schedule as just a high-level guideline for vendors and for states and for agencies. So the idea would be, do we need to roll this out further, right? So it would be the potentially the square boxes and potentially the green flags. And you can read that those represent when versions stop and when we expect there to be broad market availability of 3.5 software. The second issue relates to the tools, right? So we've been attempting to develop some tools that would help facilitate the rollout of 3.5. We have some YouTube videos that talk about the need for 3.5 and how it makes corrections specifically geared towards reducing the burden of data collection on our EMS providers. And so those can be incredibly helpful. We have those in PowerPoint presentations as well that states can use or vendors could utilize. We've developed a number of fact sheets to educate people on the use of UUID, the change to e-disposition 12, and the transition to a disposition group, talking about defined lists, and then our further harmonization with CARES. So those are the fact sheets that we have out there. They're 2-pagers, lots of illustrations, very little text, trying to help people really kind of understand those topics. We talked about the timeline. We've also tried to improve the data dictionary. You'll notice now for both the 3.4 and the 3.5 web-based data dictionaries, when you open those, and also the PDFs, we list, for example, the schematron errors and warnings that are associated with each element. Really trying to help the state data managers and others who are trying to define and help EMS agencies understand the warnings and the errors to help facilitate your communications with them as they say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing wrong with this element, right? We try to facilitate that work. So that's what has been done to date. So there's really 3 questions that we'd like to have you break out, and then we'll come back together and again, have each of the breakout groups report, maybe spend a little bit more time, more than 2 minutes per group. Really the 3 questions, and we'll make sure that you have access to these questions while you're in your breakout groups. As I mentioned, is the current timeline, as we have set it back by 6 months, does it still remain too aggressive? Would love to hear your opinions on what you think about that. Next, as I mentioned, how do we roll out these V3 information that we have already provided? How do we make those known to states and to agencies in a way that they feel like they have the ability to be informed? As was mentioned, I think in the last session, as we were talking about HIPAA and data security, a lot of the questions that came up was just, how do we educate other people who are fearful to share their data that there's safeguards in place and that it's okay to do it, right? How do we get the information into the right hands? And are there additional items? I mean, let's be creative. Eric had a great comment. I mean, is PowerPoint presentations too old? Do we need to Do we need to have different approaches that would allow us to really be able to make sure that this is reaching the right people? So please be kind of creative about that. The final question to both vendors and states, with the rollout of version 3 going from version 2 to version 3, and as we've gone through different versions of version 3, we've attempted to track the state's plans for transitions, and that has become an incredibly valuable document. The vendors use it a lot when they're trying to harmonize the transition of agencies and states to a new version. I think the states use that to promote among their state the need to, we need to get on the ball. We're just 6 months out, kind of a thing. So this tracking the goals for the process of transition within states has been incredibly valuable. We've just kind of maintained an Excel spreadsheet in the past. Is there a better way that we could provide that out on the website or in some other format that would also help everybody stay engaged at the state level and nationally as we attempt to make that transition? So I'll ask first, before we go to our breakout session, are there any questions about those 3 broad groups of questions? Okay, all right. Let's go ahead, Chris, and put folks into their group for 15 minutes, and we'll look forward to a lively conversation when you return. Yes, you're now all teleported back into the main meeting. Thank you very much for spending your time on these 3 kind of important topics. We have some time here for report out because we still have 12 groups. Probably not a lot more time, maybe 3 minutes per group. We're going to handle the first question, though. Is the current timeline too aggressive? After you've had some good conversation here, we're going to go ahead and post a poll, a yes or no poll to address this question. And then if you have other further comments you want to share as we go through the breakouts related to this topic, feel free to share. But let's get an overall feel for how the group is currently feeling about the timeline. Is it too aggressive? So Chris, can you go ahead and launch that poll? All right, so the poll is up. Feel free to vote. Do you feel the current timeline is too aggressive? Wow, okay, very, very close polling results. Please vote if you want to. 40 or just a couple seconds left if you want to go ahead and vote. We had about 80% of folks vote. Okay, fantastic. A pretty split crowd, 57% to 43% in favor of yes, it remains too aggressive. So not as big of a span as we might have thought. Clearly, things can change very rapidly as they have throughout this entire year. But this is very helpful information. So thank you. All right. If you have other comments related to the poll, please feel free to provide them as you report out. I'm going to try once again to see if I can count backwards. Let's begin with group 12. Breakout group 12, do you want to report out?
All right, yeah, so we had both some samples from Wyoming and Ohio as well that were able to contribute what worked for their 3-4 transition. So definitely the personal attention seems to be the deciding factor in the success of the distribution. The transition to version 2 was done, agency by agency, versus then 3-4 was done more of a top-down, leadership conference approach, and was mentioned that the personal approach had a much higher success rate. They not even just virtually, but physically, they went to individual agencies across their whole states and their counties, doing 2 sessions a day, and that helped the success with those rollouts.
Thank you, David. Breakout group 11.
Hi. So pertaining to the first question, is the timeline too aggressive? We all kind of decided no, we didn't think it was. How do we roll out 3.5 information to states and agencies? A video from NEMSIS would be really helpful to start educating agencies. I think right now a lot of our agencies are not aware that 3.5 is coming, or if they do know that it's coming, it's really far off. So they're not putting a lot of energy into it at this time, but it would be nice to have that video to kind of reference back to give them a heads up these changes are coming. One
Hey,
of
Kelly,
our,
could I ask a question?
yes, of course.
Was the video, would the video be directed towards basically talking about the importance of a revision, not necessarily educating on what is included in the revision?
I think I foresee actually the changes that are in the revision. So
Okay.
the demographic, or excuse me, the disposition fields and all that fun stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Clay, pardon me, real quick question, same topic, Kelly. What I'm hearing is that the training, or not the training, the information regarding the rollout, the fact that this is coming, for most agencies is coming from the actual vendor that supports them. Has anyone seen anything from the state office, any state offices to the agency saying, hey, look, this is coming, you need to prepare, here's what we're thinking, here's our timeline? I'm just looking for a good example.
I do think that our states are communicating that with their agencies. I just think that because the timeline is continuing to be pushed and it seems like such a far away item that a lot of agencies are not putting the importance that they need to, so they're not really digging in and doing the education. I do know that our states are very active and they are participating in the 3.5 and they are communicating with agencies, but I think it's just that timeline of the continual pushback that makes it, I don't want to say less important, but at the back of their minds, and they're not really focusing on it, if that makes sense.
And certainly we've had a small distraction in the last 6 months.
Right,
so
exactly.
Absolutely.
They're definitely busy at this time, so for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Breakout group 10.
So I think we figured out that it would be nice if there was the state information and timelines published, similar to the current.
Hi, I'm here. Come here.
The map with the green and the red, and either a new map or a new page would be beneficial. Also, I think that more discussion should be had on the timeline. We had a very developer-heavy group, and thusly there wasn't a lot of input from states on what a timeline should be. Our state did communicate out some of the 3.5 changes already, or at least that the changes were coming without the granular details. All of the vendors in the group sort of had a consensus that implementation burden is actually one of the higher things that we haven't really accounted for. Some of the changes, especially the e-disposition changes, are going to be pretty disruptive, not only to our customers, but to billing companies and anyone who touches an XML document that comes from any of our systems.
Yeah, thank you, Keenan. That's a good thought. That's a really good thought. Breakout group number 9. You may be on mute. This was Eric earlier. Okay, we'll skip 9. How about breakout group number 8?
Hi. So we had a couple of thoughts. The first was that we're worried about the timeline for states that have heavily customizations for their custom schematrons and custom elements. A second thought we had that was really well received was modifying the receive side API to report back what schematrons they allow and what NEMSIS version documents they allow. So you can programmatically check to see does this state accept 3.4, 3.5?
Oh.
What schematrons are they applying to their elements? There's been some problems in the past where the schematron version that's in production versus the schematron version on the Git repository doesn't quite match. And then another thought, 2 more thoughts. Once there's a certain percentage of uptake in a custom element, perhaps looking at rolling that into a dot release for the national element. So 50% of the states are asking for a custom element of some vein. That should probably be looked at as something to be rolled into the national spec. And then lastly, for relaying the information about what versions they accept, as far as like an easy change to do, maybe including that in the text file in each state's Git repository. So 3.5 is going to be implemented in this on this date. 3.4 will stop being accepted at this date. Are we jumping from 3.4 to 3.5 directly? Just getting that into the Git repo may be more useful. I know we also have the map that could work too.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. The Git repository is a great idea. Breakout group number 7.
All right, this is Adam. I'll take it. Let's see. Yeah, mixed bag towards too aggressive, mostly because of you know, we were worried about the COVID effect on EMS agencies and everyone switching over. So board, you know, tended to go on that. Additional items we kind of covered later. We did mention we did like the fact sheets. I know from developer that code translations were certainly helpful. We talked about the custom field catalog, so kind of a shared one between states, so they, you know, have a lot of things that are similar. So more reliance on, you know, coming to you know, synchronize those. So more states used from a catalog per se. To track state transitions, certainly we mentioned what we have for 3.4 as far as the US map was helpful, but also in a spreadsheet format, so we could see it by column, so we can kind of track everyone at a kind of a larger view rather than just drilling down on each state. And most notably, the weekly emails that we get are helpful for the schematron update. So anytime any news related to a 3.5 transition, I know those are certainly helpful. And I do want to I'll wait till you type up there. But someone also mentioned the word schematron, and that triggered a thought in my head. I wasn't sure if it was false here, but yeah, if we could somehow make sure that any version of a schematron update is reliant on the date of the chart. I mean, there's been too many times where you know, schematrons get updated and you have to resubmit some records from months ago and they get rejected. So you know, versioning of the schematron both on our, you know, vendor side and state sides really important as we build these things out.
Great, Adam. Very, very helpful. I'll make note that there are some states that are providing comments in the comment section or in the chat, so that may be worth viewing. Breakout group 6.
Sorry, couldn't find the mute button. So we had quite a few concerns that we were going over with regard to 3.5. So I'll just list kind of what we went over in our breakout group. So one comment that I had written down that I thought was very interesting was that it's not that it's too aggressive, it's that it's too unrealistic with regard to the timeline. And kind of going into that, why is that the case? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is a certain set of events that has to happen. For example, you need to make sure you have the repositories get their certification before anyone else. From there, you then have to have the states that are going to purchase and acquire those repositories and go to that version. And then you have the states that then require the software vendors to be on that version. And then from there, you have the states that push their, all of the agencies in their states to go to that version. So there's this whole kind of domino effect happening, and it's not just a one timeline for everyone. And that doesn't quite seem to be taken into account here. The other one is that, let's see, where was that? So kind of a question on if you don't have someone that's fulfilling requirements of 3.4, even right now, and you're already looking to transition to 3.5, that's kind of an additional burden on people to get someone to be submitting this data. And it also brought up the question, can you allow agencies to submit multiple versions of the data? Can they submit 3.4 and 3.5 to the repository? Is that a possibility? Next was kind of the fact that it's the states that decide whether they're going to 3.5 or not. They have to agree to the transitioning, and that the transitioning is important enough to push all of their vendors, all of their agencies to change compared to the headache of making that change. And then, let's see, vendors, the timeline on the NEMSIS site is somewhat irrelevant, as vendors have to comply with what the states say, not what NEMSIS says. It's the states that they're kind of beholden to. And then you have that some states have statutes that will say that the state has to be on the most recent version of NEMSIS, and that can cause a lot of concern, especially when you say, okay, this is the new version, but the repositories aren't on that yet. The state doesn't have a way of accepting that yet. They have to go through their RFP processes, and they have to implement things. And so this was something specific to like New Jersey or California or some of these other ones, that if you say, here is the new version, they, by statute, have to go to that one, even though they're not ready, and it's a very large process. And so kind of looking into how to manage that is one of the concerns that came up.
Okay, thank you, Christian, appreciate it. Breakout group number 5.
Yes, James here. I mean, we came up with pretty much everything that you see up above here. And a couple things we talked about that you can expand on too is not just with the timeline. You have a lot of agencies who are going to be on software that's probably not going to be compliant, that they're going to have to search for. And so they're going to have to be transitioning to new softwares. And for anybody in here who's sold software to an agency, that can be a long 6-month process until it goes through all of their board of directors or their presidents of the volunteer fire department boards. There's no way that they're just going to jump in a week and sign up for a new software typically. And that's nationwide. I mean, that's kind of a process everywhere. So that's probably one of the biggest things. Talking about rolling out the information to states, one of the things that a few of the vendors in our group likes is when the state releases their own little data dictionary that has some schematron rules in plain English. That makes it really easy to set up information as well. Some states kind of just hand you the data set and say, here you go. Some give their own little data dictionary that explains their rules for their states, which is really helpful. And then also with the best practice to track states transition, not just what states are 3.5 or 3.4, but what are they actually accepting? Like, are they actively accepting that data right now? Is a big thing too, because sometimes it'll say 3.4, but they might still be on 3.3.4. And just getting them over to 3.5 is going to be a challenge too. There's some states that are still transitioning to 3.4 from 2. So that timeline might be way off for some states.
Thanks, James. Good comments. Breakout group number 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think we agreed with most with everything up here. The only thing we were kind of adding is on the website, it'd be nice where we break certain information down by version 2 and version 3. If we could break 3 into 3.4 and 3.5 to see the differences would be helpful. And also, as states are implementing 3.5 and working on custom elements, it'd be helpful if we could see maybe a beta version of that before it gets published for official use, so we can kind of roadmap what they're working towards.
Great, Scott, thank you. Breakout group 3.
Kind of saying a lot. What's up there? Sorry. In relation to the release date, there was some consensus between both vendor and state to maybe push it out a little. In terms of rolling out 3.50, there was kind of the question more of, well, maybe states should be telling vendors when to meet that requirement. also there was some concern of like, well, some states may feel like they can't necessarily commit till 3.5.0 till they know that the window is not going to move anymore, and that there's no going to be like element changes prior to the actual official release date. I guess one example was just kind of like maybe focusing entirely on ET3 specifically, getting that released, and then a refocus on 3.5.0 and kind of more independently.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's helpful. Breakout group number 2.
So number 2, we had consensus that the timeline was a little bit too aggressive. From a vendor standpoint, we had to go do a bunch of COVID-19 enhancements. We've now got ET3 coming up that we just got hit with this morning. These things get interjected here, and that kind of pushes our timeline out. As for resources, perhaps a more simplified change log, something a little bit easier to read. Then we're to kind of keep everything that the map on the NEMSIS website is useful, but if it could expand upon some of the data behind the map, like transition period window, date going live, percent submitting NEMSIS 3.5, that type of thing, kind of expanding on that would be kind of be helpful. As for training, I'd also add that, this is going to be a training burden. And I think Keenan touched upon this. It's going to be a training burden all the way down the agency level, particularly with the e-disposition changes. So, we might consider that when talking about the timeline as well.
Okay, Andrew, good thoughts. Breakout group number 1.
So we pretty much touched on what's been on there. We got a pretty specific on, it was 50-50 on who thought it was aggressive, who didn't think aggressive for the 2023 full implementation. But what was brought up is it probably depends on what the state processes are for their testing that's outside of the NEMSIS TAC, right? The size of the state, how many agencies they have within the state. If you only have 10 agencies in the state, it's a lot easier than if you have 130 agencies within a state. Or the number of vendors that you have to do the testing with. It was also brought up that it is hard on states, especially with the big difference between e-disposition 12 split into multiple elements, that the longer you're on 2 versions may be more difficult for some states as well if they're accepting both 3.4 and 3.5. For the documents for the things that could be put out by the NEMSIS TAC, the one that kept getting talked about was like the best practices for states on how to get info out to their agencies, not to depend on their vendors, to make sure everyone's getting it. For example, Colorado brought up that they do webinars regularly. Arizona puts out documents. Virginia kind of did something of their own thing. But if we had a place to go where all of that information was there for the data managers to say what their best practices are. We also talked about the changelog being more non-technical so that you can give a link to agencies and they're going to understand it. So definitely I like to, so that I could understand it, right? So a layman without IT background. And then the other thing was there's a document that you have for the other versions that would be good to have for 3.5 is a spreadsheet of what is collected nationally, what is shared publicly, so that people can look at that. And it would be great if we could look at it on a national level, right, where it's got all of the different states listed and stuff. And guys, we kind of got interrupted. We were still talking. So I know there's been, and also included in the best practice, the data dictionary with rules and things like examples of what states can copy, stock like wording that they could use and borrow to put out to their agencies. So I think I caught everything, guys. If I missed anything, please unmute and let them know.
Great, Jen. Great ideas. Yeah. Anybody anybody else who has other thoughts would love to have you share those in the chat. Those are some great ideas. We'll try to kind of aggregate those ideas. We'll bring them to the bi-monthly calls, and we will definitely implement a number of those at the NEMSIS TAC level. And you're right, there are some great best practices among states. That's also a very good idea for us to post those. All right, fantastic. We thank you very much for digging into that. Clearly, people really spend some time thinking about those topics. That's incredibly helpful. We're going to take a 15-minute break, allow you to catch up on your email, other things that need to be done. We have one more major topic to cover, so please come back. We're going to split people into two groups, vendors and others that are interested in HIE. We'll have the state data managers work on a resolution for NASEMSO, but come back together and then we'll all talk about the HIE decisions that were made among the vendors. So enjoy your 15 minutes starting now, and come back a couple minutes early to win a prize. Thank you. All right, fantastic. Can folks see my screen okay? Okay, great. We have one more section, an incredibly important section. And we're just going to get right into it. We can go through the background and collect comments. I will be leading a group looking at improving our ability to exchange data in a bi-directional flow. And Julianne will be leading the state data managers to see if we can polish off an NASEMSO resolution. So, Chris, I think we're going to do this, and so that just the state data managers go into another room and the vendors just stay in this room. Is that correct?
They will be separated into two different rooms. So there will be, but yes, there it is the state and everyone else rooms.
Okay, fantastic. So those who want to follow along with the health information exchange bi-directional flow of data, just stay here, and the others will move on to a room to deal with the resolution. Let's kind of dig into them a little bit with this idea that clearly there's interest in doing some FHIR implementations, and I guess using the US CDI. Would love some feedback on that. I'm trying my best to understand this a little bit better and how it takes the place of the common clinical data set that was in place, and how that relates to the CCD and the CDA. We can talk about that a little bit, but let's kind of drill into these. I'll begin by saying that I don't think that there's, for the 2020, 2021 work that we'd like to accomplish to facilitate this exchange, item number one is not high on the list of NHTSA. So actually allowing EMS clinicians to pull data while they're at the patient site is probably the least important to them of the three. So let's dig into those a little bit, and please help me. Would love to have comments. So let's begin with that transport. You're in the ambulance transporting a patient to the hospital. We'd like to get the completed EPCR, as much as it's completed, off to the ED to offer what's safe for containers and alert. So what we go, please do.
One step back, or you said not having data at the patient's side. We're doing some work with end of life documents. We can go forward with that, but to the extent that whoever was talking about not having patient history in front of them, really want the concerned about they're going to miss something important.
Okay, and clearly we're not talking about like hindering anybody from doing that work. I mean, that's fantastic. We'd love that to move forward. All the progress that's been made is great. I think what we're talking about here is limited funds and NHTSA wanting to offer them in ways that would be helpful to improve the exchange of the lower three. But okay, yeah, thank you, David. Duly noted. All right, let's talk about, and please just help me here. Let's see if we can just devise a process for each of these three approaches over the next couple of minutes. And I would appreciate your input. I think we need to think about this in regards to early adopters and then those who are not going to be early adopters, right? So I think clearly FHIR version 4 is the direction to go, and maybe it's most appropriate in this exchange. But let's talk about it a little bit, right? So what we did in the past is we provided an HL7 version 3 implementation guide that really moved common elements found in the patient care report from the back of an ambulance to an ED. That was quickly picked up by folks, changed in ways. HL7 did not do a good job of maintaining the standards, so it was modified greatly, but I think it provided a good jumping off point. But what do we want to do now? What do we want to do moving forward? And I'll open it up. Yeah, Renee,
so
please.
Clay, what type of information are you looking, like what type of information are you thinking of when you talk about alerting the hospital? Are we talking about just like cardiac arrest, stroke, trauma stuff, or are we talking about more of, the hospital is getting alerted that, this patient's coming in with chest pain and this is their history and, things and their vitals and all that stuff? Are you looking for real-time submission of this data as it's occurring?
Right. More than just the alert, right? So actually data flowing across the channel. Yep. Is that
also talking about like pre-registration of the patient in the hospital EMR system?
Sean, can you say again? I'm sorry, I spoke over you.
Are you also talking about pre-registration of the patient into the EMR system to receive the information?
Right. All of the different types of exchanges that you're doing now to ensure that information flows into the ED system, either before arrival or at arrival, right? This isn't just alerting of a trauma or cardiac arrest or STEMI patient. Does that help, Sean?
It does, thank you.
Okay.
I guess I'm just from a clinical perspective, as a paramedic, I'm just wondering how this information would be beneficial to the ED, from a, say, demographic perspective, when a lot of times some of the information we obtain in the field isn't even accurate to begin with.
Yeah, James, I guess it's a good question. There's clearly software that is doing this now. Some have like a consolidated EPCR short form that they're sending to the hospital before they arrive or at arrival time. I'm not exactly sure all the elements that are included in that. But there's clearly different implementations that are now pushing data to the healthcare facility before or at the time of arrival.
So, there's companies like Pulsera, ESOHR's alerting platform, but they're essentially currently separate applications to the EMR system of Epic and Cerner. So one of the challenges is, okay, the facility ED is getting these alerts, but it's through a separate system. And one of the challenges we face is, okay, once that information is there, how do you then get it into the EMR system, post-event or during the event? And right now, you're using standard HL7 information exchange to do that.
Yeah, and Sean, usually it's not real time either. Usually that's something that's occurring, after the completion of the call.
With Pulsera and EHR alerting, that's real time, but the information that then gets transferred into the EMR system, it depends. It's basically once after the patient's registered, right? So they actually have the record on file to then attach the EMS information.
Yeah, and I'll open this up. I apologize. I may have stated this and narrowed this too much, James. Yeah, this includes really the information you may complete after the patient arrives, right? So this I'm really talking about hopefully not the actual alerts, right? I'm trying to talk about, I think, the movement of the EPCR into the health record of the patient at the hospital.
Okay. So yeah, I guess that's all right. That makes sense. Because usually that's something that the crews may not even be done completing until, you know, later in the day, depending on the type of call that they're running. So
Clay,
that's why I was a little confused.
Is the transport piece what's kind of messing this up in thought process? So let's look at this from like the ET3 model approach or treatment in place approach, where this data is flowing into the patient's record at the hospital that's being consulted with by the EMS provider in the field, and the patient ends up not being transported, but this data ends up getting into their hospital record. Does that help maybe clear up the conversation a little bit? Because there would be no real after the fact at the hospital for that particular case if they were treated in place or treated and released. I think that's where some of this conversation was coming from.
Yeah, I shouldn't have associated with this. I shouldn't have associated this with a safer model to that extent. I apologize. It's really just including EPCR data in the EHR. And how's that doing? How's that happening now? And where do we want to go with that? And I see Doug's hands up.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you referring to the SAFER model in California? Because I can tell you how we're doing it there. We're doing it with 7 counties. And how it works is the paramedics on the scene look up the information. It's all connected to HIEs. If there's a match from a hospital, that information comes back, populates the demographics, medications, allergies, the pulse, DNR information. And then as soon as they select a destination for transport, it does send a message directly into the EHR, depending on the system. Epic, we send a message directly into it. It goes into the ED, into the new patient section. Meditech does the same. Some of the other ones, we send a message through our hospital hub system because they don't have the capability of receiving that into their EHR. So that's kind of one of the challenges in this California system is it just depends on the EHR who will take that information. The other challenge we ran into, I know you put fire on here, is most of these hospitals are not accepting HL7 fire standards yet. They're still accepting the standard HL7. So we're kind of transitioning depending on the vendor of what message are they going to take, what HIE file format are they going to take. So fire is out there, it's getting more popular, but not everyone could take that information so far.
Yeah. Backing up just one quick one, that question, are you sending, so it's different on their end, are you sending the same data set to each one? And is it the complete typical, I'll use the word typical, EPCR record from the EMS side, or is it a subset of data specifically designed to send to them?
It depends on the vendor. So we send all the data as data elements in a standard format. And some are taking it and putting it in different sections of the EHR, updating their medical history, medications, and the counters. Some are just putting it in a pre-hospital tab and just stacking all the information. We have one EHR that doesn't want the raw data, they just want a PDF. So it just depends on what they want. And that's the one challenge of California is the HIE SAFER program didn't put really specifications on what the hospital standards were, more on the pre-hospital, what we're going to collect and what we're going to send. But some hospital systems are not choosing to accept everything that we're sending them. So we are sending them the traditional file, just like any other healthcare industry. And then it's just depending on what they want to digest and where do they want to put
it. And Doug, that's digestible at the element level, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I think that's exactly where we want to go is that model, and I think hopefully with the idea that if Eric pays for something in this exchange, I think he'd like something where element level data is exchanged, and I agree. Fire is probably where we want to go, but hence my second and third questions here is what can we do to facilitate this exchange in the short term and kind of the longer term? I think probably some type of an implementation in Fire version 4 would be helpful in the future, but is that too far out?
So if I can say something.
Yeah, please, Christian. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. I think it's really important that we're looking at Fire version 4, specifically because of the Cures Act, which is starting to, it's going to be a requirement that data exchange happened using FHIR. And any like custom version of doing this data exchange is not allowed. And so I think that focusing on FHIR is what we have to do, because we have until 2022 to really start getting these things, really have an understanding. That's when they're going to start imposing fees on people for that. So I think having this is where we need to be. So
I
just
don't think there's any discussion in our office or with your office of using anything else other than FHIR, right? That we've kind of put to rest.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's a comment to me. Yeah, I fully agree with that, and it's good to hear. And we'll get to you in just a minute, Jennifer. And I also want to make sure that I think Tim is taking notes for us here.
And just one other quick comment on that is the timeline that was just mentioned. I would, having set in on some of these national level development processes, that timeline was developed. Their hospitals are up against the same challenges that we're up against that we mentioned earlier. We're seeing ANOVA in the Maryland, Virginia area, $86 million in a hole going in, and others are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know that I would not plan for it, but I would say that 2022 guideline is more of a target at this point. And as far as imposing fines and such, I at this point, and that could change with the new administration if there's a new administration, but 2022 is a very lofty goal for something like this, especially given what's happened in the last 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, Jen, did you have comments?
I did, and kind of a comment and a question. On the implementation guide, are we going to establish when, like the timeline? So I have some worry about sending information prior to, doing all of the data checks. So is the push to the ED hospital from the EMS system supposed to be after everything is done and the call is completed and it's been transmitted and checked and everything's correct? Because then that wouldn't be before transport. Or is this during the call as the call is going on? And then that would bring my other question of what happens when a crew has, changed the information they had, or the patient says, oh no, I am allergic to something, and they change that after something's been sent. I'm just wondering about the timeline and the validation of the information that's being shared between them.
Yeah, that probably varies by implementation, I would assume, Jen. And yeah, I'm not sure how Epic or Cerner are handling those type of things. Clearly, corrections to the record probably happen often. But it's a great question. I don't think here we're trying to stipulate when it's completed or what's completed. It's just the process of how that data is exchanged, and can we offer some help? Frank, I think you had your hand up next.
Sure. So the real roadblock for us in this is just a unified approach from the hospitals, from the EHR providers. I mean, all of these vendors, I think I can speak, certainly for us, but probably any of us, we're very familiar with converting and translating this data and exporting it to all kinds of parties. We're fine with that, but having a unified way to send it to hospitals and getting their buy-in from the major EHRs is the real piece that's missing here.
Right, and that's a great comment. I think that's where we're trying to go here. So yeah, thank you for that comment. I think we're trying to see if we as an industry can have a common approach to our side of the handshake. Now I realize that differs right now in many different ways, but if moving forward with FHIR, for example, or something in more of the short term, is there something we can apply here that could help with ensuring okay, Cerner Epic, they want to connect to EMS. There's a I don't think it's going to be a standard platform, but is there something that we can develop that would help that be more of a standardized approach? Steve from MacroLogic.
This is a follow-up to the timeline question regarding when the actual data is proposed to be sent to the ED, for example. The question comes up about, has any thought been given to the infrastructure that would need to be in place for that to happen, especially in rural areas where the crews may not have any internet access to the hospital and can hook up to the hospital's access point?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm sure those are important resource questions. I think our approach here, Steve, is to just see if we can define the approach or the platform.
Steve, Clay is absolutely right in what our approach and our sort of task and thought is for this project. But I will tell you the other answer to your question is yes. In fact, the National EMS Advisory Council has heard multiple presentations from everybody from FirstNet to folks from CMMI on their thoughts as this rolled out. And then we had one of the rural organizations, and I can't remember the name of it, also do presentations and talk about those connectivity issues and what the real challenges were. Is it just a financial thing? Is it there's not incentive to do it? And then it really came down to what is the physical infrastructure like? Is it just not possible? And then they really came down to a couple interesting comments. One is that there may be parts of the country that are just so rural that the persons per square mile just will never, ever get to a point where it's of benefit for any vendor to work in that particular area. So they've had a lot of discussions about those topics, especially as ET3 really started to roll out, because if you recall, ET3 was not extremely oriented towards the rural environment when it opened up. They had specific levels of volume that they wanted to meet in an area for them to participate. And that's when the rural people sort of got up in arms, and that's when this topic became a big point of discussion. So yes, there's been a lot of conversations. I can't say there's been a lot of solutions other than some realization that there's some areas where this is just going to be a difficult task.
I definitely agree. I just wanted to ensure that there wouldn't be solution, or there wouldn't be a standard set in place before there were actually solutions to handle those standards.
Yeah, and I can't guarantee you that's not going to happen. I will tell you that there seems to be, as a result of even before COVID and now even more so into COVID, there were more financial opportunities for rural areas because of some of the rural health incentive programs than there are for some of the urban areas. So that may be an advantage. We just have to figure out how to capitalize on it.
Agree.
Hey, Greg. Doug, you have your hand up.
Yeah, as we discussed the approach, do you guys see the vision of vendors connecting directly to these EHRs, or do you see vendors connecting to a HIE or a third party? Because that's what we've been doing in California. And because each health system is usually a silo, it's easier to connect to a HIE, and that's what we've been successful with. And I don't know what is the long-term version, or if other vendors have had success connecting to direct healthcare organizations, or I'm just trying to, how can this be sustainable and scalable?
Yeah, Doug, is a great question. Peter, I see your hand up.
I guess my question just comes down to, have we considered the ethical implications of kind of grabbing all of this data for large portions of the population? And this is stuff that wouldn't be anonymized. This would be unique to individuals, otherwise it would be useless. And just having that much information on these people who can access it, it just seems like this is one of those slippery slopes for me.
Yeah, Peter, I think we're talking about, of course, the EPCR going to the hospital. Is there or into an HIE? So you're saying there's data there that you don't think that the health information exchange should exchange?
I'm more worried about the beginnings of this, because once that data is in the HIE, who accesses it, who writes the laws around it? What is that data being used for? And this is, as a private citizen, I would be worried about as much possible information being shared as what I think we're talking about. Because this doesn't just affect EMS. If we start pushing for things like this, there are larger ramifications across the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, that's a little out of our bailiwick, but it's an important issue. Sean, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so to kind of help facilitate the conversation that Doug brought up in terms of scalability, as well as the concerns about the use of data. At the HIMSS conference, or that was going to happen this year before COVID hit, we attended the HIE Connect-a-thon. And one of the benefits there is you get exposure to like Epic and Cerner, and what they work on is basically connecting with their IHE profiles. I met with Andrea Forquette there, and she was promoting EMS data standards for routine interfacility patient transports, paramedicine care summaries, and quality outcome reporting for EMS to try and get adoption for those kind of specific use case data standards for EMS vendors like ourselves to work with like Cerner and Epic to build those data standards. And I think it'd be great, Clay, if you reach out to them and kind of partner with them from a NEMSIS standpoint to facilitate the promotion of those profiles. And that'll create that standard that we're looking for.
Yeah, Sean, that's great. Can you state her name again and who she was associated with?
Andrea Forquette, she's the informatics consultant for IHE.
For IHE, that's okay. For any specific IHE or just for a company called IHE?
It's IHE USA.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. Got it.
Was she at the? That name sounds familiar, but I don't know.
Yeah,
why.
she was. We invited her to the ONC meeting in Washington.
Okay.
So she was there to
Perfect.
participate, just listen in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. So thanks. This has been great information. We have a couple more things we wanted to talk about, and we've got some limited time left, a little over 15 minutes. So I'm going to just I'm going to summarize here. It looks like what we should be considering and starting work on is basically a FHIR version 4 implementation that helps the movement of data from an EPCR into a hospital HIE or into EHR or into an HIE. Does anybody feel like there are short-term options we also need to consider? I want to make sure we're out in front of this, but if there's other things that can help in the short term, like the next 2 to 3 years, as people are making this migration to FHIR, if there's something else that we can do that would relate to some of their kind of messaging or some of their approach, I'd be happy to consider that as a dual project, right? Doing two things is what I'm trying to say.
How about some reconciliation potentially? So HL7, how well it maps up with NEMSIS 3.5, I'm not exactly sure, but just as we did a realignment with CARES, maybe there needs to be a realignment with HL7 FHIR. Although I'm not sure.
FHIR?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a 2 or 3 year project though.
Okay, how it aligns. Okay, yeah, that work is going on right now among others. Okay. Other things like that? Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate folks staying engaged. What I think is the more complex issue is this one, and I'm gonna summarize what we've talked about in the past and kind of where we think we'd like to go. So this is kind of the hospital pushing data back into the EPCR record at the EMS agency, or the EMS agency pulling it. I'm not sure how folks have done that in the past. We worked hard to develop a CCDA R2 that would push data from the discharge summary from a hospital system back into an EPCR system that was not completely helpful because of a number of concerns raised several years ago, many of which we talked about this morning. What we decided in last year was to develop some type of a model like this, right? So this was based off the CCDA, and maybe we need to rethink this if we start talking about the US CDI. But clearly, what the idea was here was that there are sections in the discharge summary on this side of interest to EMS. And then there are other sections within these implementations, specifically the discharge summary, that we weren't interested in, right? So the idea was for us to develop some type of a process whereby there's an external document, an external XSD document maintained by NEMSIS that's separate from the NEMSIS standard right now. So remove the e-outcome section basically from the NEMSIS standard, have a freestanding document that has its own life cycle that incorporates elements from the CCDA discharge summary, and then having that, I think I have another slide. I think having that be a separate document with a separate lifestyle or life cycle, sorry, and then for us to reconnect that to the NEMSIS file with the UUID in 3.5, right? So the vision for moving the outcomes data that we want at the national level, that could be sitting in this XSD template. It includes other elements that the state may want or that an agency may want, but there would be a set of data that could be reconnected to an existing NEMSIS record at the state level or the national level using a UUID. So that was kind of the idea to help push this type of a model forward. And we can do that in, can reconsider this in FHIR, and with the new types of elements that are coming out in this US CDI, I've got to understand that better. Or if we just think that's too far out, to do this with the CCDA R2. So I'll open it up again for comments, and maybe my thoughts here are too naive. So feel free to help me connect these dots. Yeah, Sean.
So, I mean, I'm in agreement that a separate document makes a lot of sense with a separate life cycle, just because the information getting collected from the hospital could be, hours, days later, weeks later, especially if the patient's in the hospital facility for a while. So it makes total sense to have a separate document for outcomes.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, and to speak to your point, I mean, we've never really formalized an approach for the collection of e-outcome data. So this would be that approach. Doug?
Clay, what's the percentage now of e-outcome data you get into your system now from just repeat from hospitals sending outcomes back to vendors updating that NEMSIS file back to you? Do you know what that percentage is roughly?
Yep, it's about 7 to 12%. It's probably closer to 12% now.
Okay. I don't mind a separate process. I think it has some benefits, but I also think it's important to get that data back to the end users and clinicians. I don't know if we need to rebuild a new process, because ideally if that hospital pushes data back to the EPCR, that EPCR should send that record back to NEMSIS with a change. Ideally that, hey, look, these are the new changes. Outcome data has been put back in this record, versus sending two separate paths. And that could be, I'm not a developer, and I'll fully admit that. It may be easier doing the second path. I know that we would want that data going back to the clinicians and back to our agencies. So that would trigger a repeat NEMSIS file back to you guys as soon as that outcome fields do get populated.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. And that's a great question, right? So, so at the national level, and I'm sure at your software levels, particularly the receive and process products. We have a mechanism for the replacement of an old file with an updated file, right? That'll move to UUID with version 3.5. Right now it's a hash, but so that process would be in place. And so, Doug, I think your good question you're asking here is whether or not we can just implement something, keeping e-outcomes where it is, and just having a record update, or whether we need to maintain a different, separate XSD template.
And yeah, thanks for making my question sound a lot more intelligent. But yes, exactly it. That's what I was trying to relay.
Yeah, Sean?
So I guess I'd say if we keep it in the NEMSIS document, the elements there, then you run into the challenges of validation. You can't force requirements around data quality and the information you get, because it's really an EMS document. It's not hospital outcomes. With a separate document, they can start enforcing data quality standards, which is really what IHE profiles are really intended to do. So you're kind of creating a separate IHE profile in that sense, where you're ensuring the data quality of information being exchanged back to the EMS providers.
Oh, okay, Sean. Okay, so that's an interesting point. Okay, that makes sense. Nate?
Hey, so yeah, I'm with Emergency Reporting, another vendor. It's interesting talking about getting the data back from the hospital in particular, because then that says, like right now we collect the information, we send it off to the state, makes it to NEMSIS. So essentially everything's kind of pointed towards the one source where ultimately it's going to be captured and recorded and held. It's interesting to talk about then how do we get the outcomes information back from hospitals. If we're getting it from each hospital, that does mean we'd have to figure out some kind of integration with every hospital. And the hospitals have to figure out integrations with all the vendors where they're trying to push the data back to. Versus if we say, hey, the hospitals are going to get in the same game as the vendors are right now, which is ultimately it's going up to the TAC, then the vendors, seems like to me, would be able to just pull it from that one place. It simplifies the architecture in my head, just the network, like how many connections we have to make. I'd be curious if that's a consistent thing, or if you adjust that thought.
Oh, Nate, wow. So that's an interesting model. So I think what you're talking about is like having just one endpoint at the TAC that all hospitals or other sources of patient outcome data connect to, and then we populate that section and make it available back out to states and agencies. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And that would go with, we'd split e-outcomes out of the PCR and have it be a separate document. And then like was mentioned, like then the hospitals could have their own schematron that they're pushing to make sure the data is valid and everything. And then it'd just be fished out by interested parties. Wow.
That is a novel model. I'll just say, Nate, that's a novel model.
Okay.
No. I can see what you're saying and what it improves. Other vendor thoughts on this idea? Are other people doing different things than yeah, let me qualify this question. I'm gonna take us back. Are there other comments about the idea of just keeping e-outcomes as it is, or having it a second document with a lifestyle? I think, or with a life cycle. I think what Sean shared is important. Any other comments about those two different ideas?
Josh has his hand up.
Oh yeah, thanks, Josh. Yeah, sorry, I'm not watching as closely as I could be. Sorry, Josh.
No problem. Hey, Clay. A couple things that we have heard in favor of doing a separate document for outcomes that I would be curious to get input on. One of those is we've heard that there may be a reluctance to receive data from a non-EMS source back into and embed it in an EMS PCR. The idea that, hey, the EMT didn't actually provide that data. And so it sounded like there was a preference to keep that data in its own document rather than modifying the original document created by the EMT. So I don't know if that's a real concern for everyone or not. Would be interested in feedback. And then the other piece was the recognition that you could have multiple outcome sets for a single patient care report because the patient ended up going to multiple hospitals. In the current model, it all gets kind of merged together. You know, hospital diagnoses, for example, if you got diagnoses from the 2 different hospitals that the patient went to, then they all kind of get stacked together, I guess. With a separate document, then those could be actually housed as 2 separate outcome documents from the 2 separate hospitals that the patient went to. So yeah, I would be interested in feedback on either of those topics.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Renee?
Yeah, just to Josh's first question. So yeah, Josh, there is concern amongst local agencies about having that outcome data populate the original EMS record for liability, for lots of different reasons, but they do need it, and it's very valuable as part of their quality assurance processes. So it wouldn't be most of their first choices to have it be populated back into the record. It makes more sense for them to have it linked to it somehow, but not part of the actual record.
Hey, this is Eric. Can I just follow up on that question? You mentioned concern in terms of liability. What liability? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so if there was a bad outcome of the patient and it ended up in court and I don't know if I can give a really good example.
So it would clearly show that the care provided by a pre-hospital didn't match the outcome that came back
Correct.
from the hospital. Gotcha.
Correct. Yeah.
Understand.
But they of course need it for training purposes and improving protocols and patient care and all of that. So it's vital to them. Just scary for them to have it in the record.
And there's a discoverability clause for quality assurance data. So I
Correct.
don't know how that plays into whether it fits into the quote unquote quality section of the report, or is this the argument for the second report?
Yeah, so it could get a little tricky as long as the agency was protected from being able to from discovery on that as part of the original PCR record.
I suppose if that data had a clear data source element as well, that it was clear that it's not the reporting agency's data, that could be okay too.
Yeah, Keenan, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just as the standard is written right now, it's impossible because there is not a data source element or attribute to any of those data elements. That's kind of where I was going. He kind of beat me to it, Frank. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Keenan. Yeah, you're right. There's development here that needs to happen. I'm getting the feeling that we're still kind of siding with this idea of a freestanding XSD structure or template that kind of sits separate and reconnects. And I think the UUID will help us with that.
Doug has his hand up.
Oh, yeah, Doug, please.
I was just wondering, does anyone know of any white papers or case studies that the outcome data is either a part of the legal record or is not a part of the legal record? And if not, Clay, I'm wondering this would be maybe a good white paper that NEMSIS maybe could put together and seek some guidance through the marketplace. Because I'm curious about that, because it is not documented a part of the crew. It is outcome data coming in from a different area. We don't put it, we allow our clients to decide if they want it on their run forms inside the record or not. We store it in a database for reporting for CQI if they don't. So they choose, they make the decision. But I would be curious to determine if there's any history or if there's any white papers that says e-outcome data or outcome data is a part of the paramedics medical record, or if it's determined to be clinical and exempt from requests. Yeah,
it's a great idea, Doug. I'll take that idea. I'll put that forward with the comments from this morning. That's a great idea.
I have a state in mind that I know that already has sort of a rule around collecting outcome data for ALS calls with admissions. So it might be advantageous to reach out to that state data manager first.
Who was it, Keenan? Sorry.
I think it's New Jersey.
Oh, New Jersey? Okay.
Hey, Clay, to tag on to this comment, how is that any different than us sending data into the hospital EMR record? It does become part of the patient record. So in a service I was a part of, we dealt with this with the hospital, and us sending the record to them is most surely discoverable, just the same as them sending something back to us. So it's all kind of fruit of the same tree because it's the patient record. So I don't know that there necessarily needs to be a lot of effort put into that, because there's already a lot of legal standing on that part, that it's part of the HIPAA patient record, and any exchange in that, whether we're sending the data to the hospital or they're sending us back the outcome data, it's still part of that patient record.
Right, and I agree with you. There does seem to be a difference in how a patient care record in the pre-hospital setting is treated versus a hospital setting a little bit in this regard. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to hear from some folks who swim in these waters every day, like Ryan, if there's some precedent that we can direct folks to. It's a great question. Tim, could you check and see when they're going to pull us all back together? I think we're going to try to come back together for just the last little bit before we end for the day. I know the data managers want to hear a little bit about what we discussed here. Clearly, I think we talked high level about a lot of issues, got a lot of things off the table that needed to be taken off, but we probably need to drill down a little bit more. I think we're still migrating to this idea of a separate XSD template that's connected with the UUID. So that's probably still a good idea. What I'd like to do is, if this model stands, and I wasn't going to show this slide if we thought there was a different approach, but this are some initial thoughts that were put together by Rich out of ESO, who's moved on, but he with Prashant from Image Trend put together some steps that we would be required to kind of define this freestanding XSD template, and have a work group that would be associated with this work. So maybe if folks feel like this is still heading down the right direction, then we'll move forward with developing or reestablishing, re-resurrecting that group that held a couple of meetings before we kind of halted things with what was going on nationally with federal work, and then with COVID. Any feelings about this approach? Maybe some folks were actually on this committee and did a little bit of work. Any thoughts? Okay, great. It looks like the state folks are funneling back in. Thank you very much. I appreciate you breaking off and working on the resolution. Hopefully you made some good progress. I wanted to make sure that I could update you a little bit on the discussion we had with the vendors regarding information exchange, particularly bidirectional flow of data, making sure that you have an opportunity to comment on it. And among those vendors that we kind of worked on this idea a little bit more, solidified some ideas, worked through some potential issues associated with them. Feel free to chime in if you have any questions. I'm not going to watch the chat as closely as I was watching them before. So Julianne, whoever is responsible for raised hands and chat, that'd be fantastic. All right, so I'm going to summarize just in a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it back up to see if there's other comments from the states that would be helpful. I mentioned in our work with Eric, as we have been thinking about this prior to the meeting in January, and since that time, there were a number of exchanges that are important, and we can talk about them here, right? The first one listed here is while a EMS clinician is at the side of a patient, there's a need to pull information perhaps from an HIE or other source that would have medication data, allergy data, things like that. We were hoping to not concentrate on that as much as these other type of exchanges that I think are more prominent right now. And can we develop or facilitate some tools that would help with the movement of these other 3 types of data exchanges in light of the ONC Cures Act final rule, which was just brought into effect on June 30. So let's talk about those. So the transport unit pushing their EPCR into an ED or hospital EHR, not her, sorry about that. At the time of the patient, at the time of patient transport or after completion of the transport, we got kind of hung up on those are 2 basically different things. And I apologize that I put alert here because I'm not referring here to the alert. I'm actually referring here to just the movement of the EPCR data into the hospital EHR. So that's a little misleading. Then the idea of being able to pull data out of the EHR and have outcomes data flow back into the EMS record. This is where we spent the bulk of our time and tried to re-solidify an approach. And we'll talk about that in a minute. This approach, we want to ensure that it provides a mechanism whereby the few national data points that we need in the e-outcome section as it's currently defined, that data can come back up and be available in the national repository for research purposes, for states to pull back into who don't have ways to connect that data. So that's also very important. And this all needs to be put in perspective in regards to the recent Cures Act that really indicates that moving forward, we need to be utilizing as an implementation tool FHIR version 4. And there's a new data set core called the US CDI that I need to understand better that defines elements like procedures and medication elements and patient demographic elements that would be exchanged. So to summarize briefly, those 3 approaches, right, that we wanted to concentrate on, this idea of pushing the EPCR to the hospital, I think we settled on the approach to go ahead and not worry about current implementations or trying to grease the wheels with what's currently going on, but to spend money made available by Eric here to develop a HL7 FHIR version 4 implementation that would move an EPCR into an EHR. And we'd probably concentrate on common elements that are found in an EPCR in that implementation, with the idea that if there are specialty elements that a state collects that they want to have move into a hospital record, they'd have movement within that implementation guide to do that. Did I correctly define that, the vendor folks who were on the call, on the breakout call?
Sounds pretty right.
Okay, all right, David, thank you. Then for this more complex issue, we've spent some time on this in the past, and it sounds like the consensus that we've talked about in the past still holds true, that rather than trying to maintain a process whereby patient outcome data would flow back into an EPCR at the agency level using the current e-outcome structure within the EPCR, rather than doing that, to develop and maintain a separate XSD template that's a separate document, it has a separate life cycle that concentrates on elements that are currently present in the discharge section of the CCDA that are pertinent to EMS agencies as shalls, for example, and then having these sections that really aren't important to EMS agencies perhaps being may add items in this external document, but building an external document that could collect patient outcome data wanted by the agency, wanted by the state, and wanted at the national level and that freestanding template would be reconnected to the existing EPCR for that patient using the UUID that's available in version 3.5.0. That's very, very high level again. And the reasons for that, the reasons why that was important to take that kind of an approach rather than just having these elements repopulate in a updated version of an EPCR is that there's concern about the EPCR serving as the EMS medical record for that patient and liability for having elements enter that record that weren't collected by the EMS provider at the time of the call. We're going to be doing some work to see if there is some legal precedent for patient outcome data populated in the EPCR, but we're planning to take this approach moving forward. So I'll stop there first, and I'll first ask the vendors any clarification. I'm not particularly good at describing this. Are there other details that can be helpful here for the state representatives? Okay. If this is the approach that we feel like we'll move forward with, then in our implementation calls and by putting together a work group, we would propose a process whereby we gather the elements that each states are wanting to see, that agencies are wanting to see. So we'll reach out to those vendors that are currently doing this work and trying to collect whatever agencies want to see in regards to patient outcomes or states want to see, try to consolidate those requirements, and then evaluate the CCD or the CDA discharge summary template to see how many of those are captured there. Hopefully that's where most of the elements are coming from. That, for example, Image Trend is bringing back, ESO is bringing back their Beyond Lucid. I know there's several vendors that are working on this type of a process, so they'll be included in the work group, and then try to draft out that eOutcomes XSD freestanding document would be the approach we would take.
Dr. Mann?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Would it be beneficial to bring in HIE vendors or the hospital vendors into this discussion? Because right now it's everything, from my understanding, it's all EMS side.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great comment, Juan. See if we can entice someone from that world to serve on our work group. That could be incredibly valuable. Yeah, thank you.
Like we had representatives from
our HIE vendor is actually going to take the NEMSIS standard as their as a file that they're going to collect. So this way we don't have to modify anything on our end. So we're going to send them the actual NEMSIS file, and then they're going to send us back their HL7 version 2 document back. So, but bringing somebody in like that to know what they were doing and what they would prefer.
Okay, well, I'd like to call you later if I could, maybe next week, and collect more information about what you're doing, Juan. Is that helpful? Or would that be okay?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Eric, and I interrupted you, sorry.
No, that's okay. We had Cerner and Epic and other representation in January, and we will certainly reach back out to them to talk about this as well. But yeah, definitely we will have a lot of people involved who we're not typically working with over.
All right. Yeah, good. Other questions among the states who really didn't have a chance to dig into this in detail with the other group. Any other questions about this approach? Does this seem reasonable? It looks like we have some more comments. And okay, Chris, yeah, thank you. And Okay, yeah, thank you, Ann. It would be valuable to move this forward. Will this be a separate, Amber asks, is this a separate data set? If so, will this be part of the NEMSIS standard, trying to think how we would implement an obligation for the facilities if we only have oversight of EMS agencies? Right, so that becomes an important question. And partially, Amber, I think the reason why they're connecting it is to kind of remove some of those concerns, right? It would be, yeah, it would be a freestanding data set that's not associated with the medical record of the patient pre-hospitally. And then, yeah, the obligation of facilities to utilize it. I think we're just attempting to provide a standard template that would reduce one-offs, right? As hospitals or HIEs try to connect with EMS data, and vendors do a great job of this, but I think even there, for HIEs, that can be problematic because several vendors can be trying to reach into the same HIE, and it just seems like there would be value in having some type of a standard. Frank, I see your hand raised.
Sure. So maybe this question's for Eric. Has there been discussion on that side, the EHR side, for sort of requiring the standard, either similar to meaningful use or under the MIPS program, the way other requirements are sort of enforced on EHR vendors?
Yeah, there has. We tried to work with ONC to get some specific things written into their rules. We've had limited success only because I don't think there's been a strong voice in the room. Rachel Abbey, who many of you probably know, and Dr. Andy Gettinger, who spoke in January, are big proponents of the EMS program. In fact, Rachel chairs one of the subcommittees for FICOMs. So we're reaching out through them. I'd like to say I'd like to say we were more successful than we were, but we've started down that process. I've really started to focus more with the vendors, the Epic Cerners of the world, because I think that's the tough one to crack. We didn't have a huge interest in participating in January. There was some arm twisting of some vendors to get them in the room, and I think I understand why, because what we're doing essentially breaks part of a revenue stream for them, to be quite honest. So that's my focus. Certainly this federal standard setting, getting that in there is a high priority. That one's a little bit more tricky, but we do have some people that can speak out for us now. This is still a big learning curve for me, and with everything changing as fast as it does, it seems like I'll give you one example. I'm working on a committee with the VA on telehealth, and the VA is implementing their new system, and it's a $6 billion effort. And a part of that, and when I say a part of that, it's probably a rounding error part of that, is the integration of EMS records into their system. But they're looking at taking that from a host of different vendors all over the country, obviously, all over the world in reality. But if we can work with them to have them write part of this process, that's another way to get something that the vendors and services need that can be shared across the country. That's just one example of some of the efforts. But quite honestly, it is a challenge. There's just that much going on, and COVID, I'm not putting any excuses out on the table. I will tell you that COVID made everything more difficult because, as someone pointed out earlier in the call, funding for projects is really going to it started to take a backseat already unless it's something specific to COVID. And my fear is after the fall, it may take an even further backseat. So that's a kind of a long-winded answer, but those are some of the efforts that's going on. I think what you're going to see from me, and you've heard a little bit about it already. Clay has talked about a work group process for this project. I've talked about an internal and external data committee. You're going to see a lot more requests from folks on this call to participate in some of these initiatives and activities. Because number one, I'm not the one with the subject matter expertise to it. One is there's only one of me, and there's a ton of these different committees out there to work with. And I'm hoping, Frank, others would be more than willing to sit in on some of those, either with someone from the Fed or on behalf of us, and support some of these initiatives. Over.
Hey, Eric, it's Mark Roberts. I just had a quick question about the funding, because we've been working on this project for about 4 years with the state, and to get the integrations going and to keep them going, the vendors are charging us quite a bit of money, sometimes in excess of $100,000 a year, just for a particular, you know, we have 33 NEMSIS in California, just our NEMSIS is over 100 grand a year. Is there going to be funding for this? Because quite honestly, I don't know how we would pay for it if it wasn't through grants that, you know, grants dry up. So that is a big consideration.
Oops, I can tell you that, and Clay's heard this conversation before, I'm a big fan of using grant money for development, but I'm not a big fan of relying on grant money for any kind of sustainment, for the reason you just mentioned. The money that we got for this project was money that I say stole, but basically use unfunded monies from DOT, and we look around for it and use that to help develop it. The sustainment piece is the second part that I'm working on, and I think I understand your chat that you put in the chat room. For me, the sustainment cost and funding that I'm trying to focus on is not specific to NEMSIS and the NEMSIS TAC. It's more specific to the state level data manager and what they need to sustain a statewide EMS information system. That's my focus right now. It's frustrating because, again, I got interrupted by something I never planned on happening, and that really kind of cut off some of my inroads. But I hear what you're saying. It's not something that has grant money programmed for it now. This is something basically for us to develop, to say that we have the commonality. We're trying to get out in front of this before there. You know, some people have already pointed out there's processes in place in different states and different places. Before there's 10,000 different ways of doing business, can we sort of standardize this up front? That's one of the questions. But I hear what you're saying. We need money for sustainment of this, and it is expensive.
Thank you. I appreciate the response, and I appreciate your work on it too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Any other questions among the states? All right, fantastic. I have a question I want to throw out, but I also want to, as we have 10 minutes left here, if you are interested as a state representative or a vendor serving on a work group to work on developing this freestanding XSD document that would collect patient outcomes data and make it available to EPCRs in the format that we've been talking about. This is really high level. I understand, and we'll have to dig into the steps and the requirements to do that. They're highlighted here at a very high level. If you're interested in serving on such a committee, I would welcome your participation. We'll bring in some other experts from outside of EMS. Juan had some good recommendations, others to reach out to the hospital side, the EHR side, and even some HIEs who do connections like this, and see if we can ensure that what we're doing is going to be most beneficial to facilitate and make this process efficient and, Mark, hopefully less expensive. So if you're interested in that, please comment in the chat that you'd be interested, and we'd love to collect those names. Well, we're keeping track of all the chat. We copy all the chat that's associated with these presentations, so we'll be able to go back through it. I do have a question. I don't know if others have been staying up with what's happening with the ONC Cures Act final rule. And I'd love if someone could offer this group a description of how the now US CDI data set, it stands for the United States Core Data for Interoperability, these new elements that are going to serve as what they'd like to be the new standard elements for interchangeability, for interoperability. How do those differ from what's available in the CCDA? And does someone have some insight into that? Do these elements take the place of those that are present in a currently constructed CCDA? Okay. We'll try to dig into that a little bit and see if we can have a better understanding of that. We're always kind of balancing the thought of, you know, if we build something with this new data standard, are we kind of setting ourselves up that this will be useful in 2023 and we provide no help for the next 3 years, you know, kind of a thing. So I think this idea of this freestanding XSD template is a great idea, but whether or not we develop it based on the CCDA discharge summary or on this new standard, we'll continue to explore that idea. And we have a call with Rachel Abbey from ONC next week. We can talk to her a little bit about this process and what would be the best approach to take. All right, so we have just a couple of minutes. This has been another incredibly just busy day with great comments provided back. Thank you so much again for hanging with us and providing this incredible valuable insight. You can just see between today and yesterday, we have so much information that we'll be able to refine and bring back to this group for further guidance. And we'll do our best to facilitate all of this work moving forward. Grateful to have Eric involved in these conversations every single day. That'll be incredibly helpful. I want to save a couple of minutes again. If you feel like there's something that you'd like us to make sure that we're covering, and the topics today that we didn't get to that would be important, or other completely independent topics, please mention those now, and we'll work them in either into the schedule tomorrow or ensure that we cover those on implementation calls in the future.
Okay, Clay, this is Amber. Can I just mention maybe we could get an update of the UUIDs and how NEMSIS and the National Trauma Data Bank might be exchanging information back and forth?
Yeah, great. Yeah, great, Amber. Thank you. And we've gone back and forth on this a little bit. I appreciate that very much. So there's great interest in NHTSA's part and in some states with utilizing the UUID to connect EMS records to trauma registry records that are collected at the hospital level. It's kind of a unique use of UUID in that there's a way, just because there's a human interaction between those two data sets that could ensure that the UUID would flow from the EPCR record into the trauma registry record, then allowing states to connect those two records and the national level to collect those two records without any patient identifiers at all, having those UUIDs connect those records together and one, save time for the trauma registrars having to collect that EPCR data into the trauma registry record, and allowing for more rich data at the national level and the state level for research purposes or for other performance measure purposes. So that's moving forward. And Eric, I think there's additional funding this next funding year to try to promote that idea and kind of educate folks on that idea. Do you want to speak to that a little?
There is, and we haven't really started anything in terms of the process for it yet. I know you and I have talked about it a little bit, but so you're going to hear a lot more about that. I'm sorry, I don't have more information on it. I mean, if you want to share some of the more details that we've talked about, Clay, you're more than welcome to. But yes, there is funding available, and we'll be starting that project here in, I guess the very near future. It's hard to believe that I'm already talking about, I just scheduled my first meeting. Someone said in 2 weeks, we'll be in October. It's like, oh my God, where'd the rest of this year go?
Yeah. So maybe we can begin this process. That's a great question, Amber. Maybe we can begin this process by reorienting people to this idea of how it would be used. And we'd love to work with you and the vendors. I think particularly ESO will have a strong interest here moving forward in regards to how this might work. So we'll begin to organize that project as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Also, thank you to both the state and vendor community who said they'd be interested in this work group. That's great. That's great. We have a lot of interest showing up in the chat. So thank you. All right, fantastic. The end of another great day. Thank you so much. I truly wish we could leave this room and gather together around s'mores in the fireplaces in the back of the hotel there at Deer Valley, but hopefully that will happen next year. So again, thank you for your participation today, and we'll look forward to meeting with you for one more period tomorrow, same time, same channel. We have two very important topics to cover, and more importantly, I think we have Neil Milan, who's been incredible at harmonizing the NEMSIS effort with ET3. He's going to be presenting on the technical progress that we've made and where we see this going in the future. So it'll be incredibly valuable if you're interested in what's happening right up to the date in regards to ET3 and how we have tried to harmonize our efforts. Please join us tomorrow for sure. So again, thank you, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.